Question number 11, the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Biosecurity. Was the government's decision to cut 100% bag scanning indicative of the priority the government places on biosecurity?
Point of order.
Point of order. The member didn't read out the question as written on the sheet.
Order.
He wants to keep up.
Order. Well, on this occasion I didn't go out because I didn't pick it up, but I'll ask the member to repeat the question.
To the Minister for Biosecurity, given he's so...
Order. Order.
Was
Order. Order. Order.
Was...
Order. It's to the Minister for Primary Industries, according to my sheet.
Oh, sorry. Mr. Speaker, question to the Minister for Primary Industries.
Order.
It's a shame he's not Minister for Biosecurity.
Order. Order.
Mr. Speaker.
Now, I think to progress, just
you,
read
Speaker.
the question.
Was the government's decision to cut 100% bag screening indicative of the priority the government places on biosecurity?
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Nathan Guy.
Yes, this allows MPI to target more resources at high-risk passengers. The only people who go through the green lane are assessed by an MPI officer as low risk, and they are still likely to be screened by sniffer dogs. X-rays are just one tool MPI uses to manage biosecurity risks. Analysis shows that passengers coming through the green lane have a higher compliance than those who do not. We are constantly exploring ways to improve and will be looking at tougher measures, but it's too early to say what they might be.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, given that Biosecurity New Zealand has previously said in its strategy that screening all bags halves the risks of incursions, why did his government stop screening all bags in 2012?
Honourable Nathan Guy.
Mr Speaker, we have a multi-layered world-class biosecurity system. We still have a very robust process on border control, and the member needs to be aware that there are 4 pathways that we focus on: cargo, craft, mail and passenger. The member also needs to be aware we've increased funding in biosecurity. We've got more frontline quarantine inspectors working on biosecurity.
Point of order. Order.
Mr Speaker, I've heard enough, and it's clear that that member, the Minister, is not answering the question.
Order. The member will resume his seat because I told him to. If the member had listened more carefully to the answers, he would realise that question was quite definitely addressed. Further supplementary?
Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David.
Have we reached the point where a senior member of the opposition is not allowed to raise a point of order without being treated rudely by the Speaker?
Order. If the member felt I addressed him rudely, I apologise. Order. I'm on my feet. But what I'm saying is that it's important to people to listen to the answers. And in that case, if the member goes back and studies the answer, he'll see that the answer certainly addressed the question.
Point of order.
Point of order.
Speaker, I carefully listened to the answer with great acuity of hearing, as good as you, I'm assuring you, and the question was about a certain specific procedure that was ceased in 2012. None of that in the Hansard will cover that, as you said, so why don't you listen to the answer yourself?
Order. And that is the sort of comment that's very unnecessary to this chamber. I invite the member, as I have already once, to go back and look at the Hansard. It might not be the answer the member, Mr O'Connor, was hoping for, but it certainly addressed the question. Are there further supplementaries? Supplementary question, the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Given the statement on his ministry's website that, quote, fruit fly is most likely to arrive with plane passengers bringing infested fruit with luggage, unquote. Page last updated 19th of February 2015, will he reinstate 100% X-ray screening? If not, why not?
Honourable Nathan Guy.
Well, if the member listened to my primary answer, and I'm not sure that he did, I said that the MPI has a real target on high-risk passengers. I also went on to say that we're continuing to review the biosecurity system and ensure that it is world-class, multi-layered, and indeed my number one priority as Minister.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Why has he not acted sooner to reintroduce 100% bag screening, given that there have been at least 3 fruit fly incursions in the last 2 years?
Honourable Nathan Guy.
Well, Mr Speaker, if the member listened to the answers that I've been trying to give him today, and if he had a look at the pathway analysis on the MPI website that he obviously hasn't looked at, that will confirm that indeed there are 4 pathways where an egg or larvae could have come in, and importantly, the member needs to realise that we've never had a breeding population established in New Zealand, which goes to show that the 7,500 traps in New Zealand are working.
Supplementary question, Joanne Hayes.
Thank you. To the Minister, what are some examples of the emphasis this government places on biosecurity?
Honourable Nathan Guy.
Mr Speaker, it's a very good question. In the last 2 years, we've roughly doubled the number of dog detector teams. We've got 15 new X-ray machines working at our international airports. We've got 130 new frontline quarantine inspectors. We've got 2 portable labs. We've stepped up a very quick response to this detection of 1 Queensland fruit fly in Auckland at the moment. And also the member will be aware, and he might have forgotten, that we're investing $68 million in a new biocontainment facility in Wallaceful. And also we've brought in government industry agreements where kiwi fruit and the pip fruit industries are sitting around with the MPI, working closely with them on preparedness and response.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable...
It was a very good question, Mr Speaker. That's why I was leaving the answer. Mr Speaker, supplementary. Did he or his officials raise any concerns with the Prime Minister as Minister of Tourism about the increased risks to biosecurity when the proposal to cut 100% X-rays was being considered?
Honourable Nathan Guy.
Mr Speaker, the whole of Cabinet made the decision to make the change.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Point of order.
Point of order. Order.
Mr Speaker.
Point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Look, the question is very clear, Mr Speaker. Did he or his officials raise concerns? It's as simple as that.
Yeah, the difficulty...
To the Prime Minister, sorry, just to clarify for the Minister.
The difficulty was I doubt whether the Minister was actually the Minister at the time, but he said the matter went before Cabinet to me. Order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order. I have a point of order from the Honourable David Parker.
With respect to your last ruling, sir, the Minister has responsibility for the actions that happened under the watch of prior people in that role. He might say, I don't know, but he has responsibility.
Well, no, but he didn't say, I don't know. He said the matter had been raised before Cabinet, which means the Prime Minister certainly was present for the discussion. So, in that regard, the question has been addressed.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, I'm just wanting clarity, because I know that ministers...
Order. I just want to be clear. I've ruled the question's been addressed. The member now relitigating that matter.
I'm just wanting an answer, Mr Speaker.
Well, I've given an answer as to whether the question's been addressed. If the member wants to raise... Order. Resume your seat. If the member wants to raise a fresh point of order, that's legitimate. If the question, the point of order now is relitigating a decision I've made as to whether that question that has been raised by the member previously has been addressed, then I've given a ruling on that. And to continue to relitigate that matter will bring this House into disorder.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Damien
that.
O'Connor.
The question would be then, what is appropriate as an answer for a minister who may not be aware of what has happened previously? I accept.
Order. And now the member's starting to waste the time of this House.
No.
Member will resume his seat.
On behalf of the people of New Zealand, Mr. Speaker.
Unless the member wants to make an early departure from the House, I suggest he sit down. Question number 12.
He wants to leave.
Order. 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 Would the member please...
Point of order, Speaker.
Would the member please resume his seat? I'm still on my feet. If the member wants to raise a fresh point of order, I'd be delighted to hear it. But if the member's going to raise a point of order relitigating a decision I've just made about the adequacy of an answer, that again is leading to disorder, and I will deal with the member quite severely if that happens. Does the member have a point of order?
Well, Speaker, I'm going to ask you this question because, frankly, it's to do with the answer...
Order.
It was to do with your explanation to the questioner. The questioner wanted to know whether the minister and his official raised an issue with a specific person or body. What we got was the decision was made by the whole cabinet. I am no wiser, and nor is he, as to the particularity of that question. Now, if that's an offence, I'm going to take the consequences.
Speaking to the point of order.
Speaking to the point of order, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, I thought the answer was very, very clear. Firstly, the member is obviously asking questions based on some official information that he's already received. Most likely, well, look at the website, it's all published. And one of the things that is most salient here is that when all of these things are put before Cabinet, the Prime Minister is sitting there chairing it. So he's saying, effectively, not only did the Prime Minister see it, but the whole Cabinet saw it. Now, I appreciate that the member's limited experience in these matters might mean he doesn't know how that works, but there's some information for him.
Order. Order. The matter has been dealt with. The answer was satisfactory. The question was whether the Minister had taken the matter to the Minister of Tourism, as I recall it. He said he had taken it to the Cabinet, which means all ministers were there. So that certainly the question has been addressed, and I should think that if the members think carefully about the answer, they will know that the answer has given the information which was required. Question number 12, Nuk Karaka.